Tell us a little bit about the divergence that we're going to see in global economic growth and what it means for different banks in different regions around the world.
Good morning, and thank you very much for that question. I think this year has been quite an extraordinary year for banking. A lot has changed, and we've seen banking profitability at all-time high, in fact, higher than the last 14 years. We've looked at the entire area of the divergence between emerging market banks and the developed market banks, and we think that paradigm has changed completely. And as we look forward, we think that while banks have benefited this year from enormous tailwinds in terms of interest rates, that could be barely transitory. And over the next year or two, banks could be facing significant challenges, both given the economic headwinds as well as the inflationary costs that come through.
So where will growth be concentrated in the banking sector, and who are the most vulnerable in 2023?
I think what we are seeing is, if you look at the next 2 to 3 years, there are 4 or 5 geographies where we see growth concentrated. The United States, we look at India, which is a rapidly growing banking market, Indonesia, Canada and Australia, and of course China. And between these countries would account for 80% of the 1.3 trillion revenue growth that we would expect over the next 3 to 4 years. Now, in terms of who's going to bet...
No, continue.
Sorry, please go ahead. Now, I was just saying that to your question on who's going to benefit from this, I think we are seeing quite a big dispersion between some banks who are really well positioned. We looked at over 2,000 banks. There are about 15% of these financial institutions which we think will benefit from both growth and profitability. The vast majority, which is 85%, are quite struggling, either because they do not have the adequate profitability or the growth potential seems muted.
In terms of specific markets, Indian banks are an outperformer.
Indeed, they are. And we've been quite surprised by the degree of outperformance relative to the other markets. So if you look at the top 3 banks, they are not only now at global scale, but also in terms of future outlook. We are looking at them trading well over 3 times book. And I think that's quite extraordinary when we look at the banking sector itself, which is trading below book even at this point in time. One of the big things that we have seen is that while banks have been profitable, valuation simply hasn't moved. And I think that India is one market which stands out, along with Indonesia, where the leading banks are significantly outpacing other institutions in terms of valuation multiples.
The worst performer was China. Obviously, COVID-0 is not helping a pre-existing property crisis there. How do you see the prospects for recovery? What are the implications for banks' balance sheets? Because we know a non-performing loan is often categorized in different ways in China.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great question. And I think one of the things we have spent quite a bit of time on is understanding the extent of the impact of the real estate crisis in China on the banking system. I think suffice to say that the real estate sector is the largest in the world, twice larger than even that of the United States. And I think when we look at that sector, which is in a crisis, and almost 40% of that is financed by debt, one of the questions we asked ourselves is, does this pose a threat to the banking sector? We looked at 13 indicators, and I think coming out of it, we feel reasonably comfortable that the banking sector will be able to withstand the shock of the real estate crisis quite well. At the same time, I think it will have an impact in terms of future growth. So I think the growth challenge will continue as a consequence of this, but the banking sector per se, we think, will be pretty stable.